Guys, got my computer back, so I'm happy to be able to make another video after what, 2 weeks off? So a little break in continuity there. Ironically then, I wanted to talk about continuity. We have lots to talk about in between Beowulf and Milton now, but I wanted to approach it by way of the idea of continuity, and what we can say was continuous between Beowulf and Milton, and what maybe wasn't in some ways. So I mean, in a way, it would be easy to say that there seems to be very little continuity between Beowulf and Milton. Just on the surface, they hardly seem to have anything in common in their language, in their poetics, and their kind of storytelling. Indeed, I think it'd be very easy to say that in literary terms, there's very little continuity between the two works, and yet. Despite the jump that we've made, there is a linguistic continuity and a cultural continuity between the two, only with certain major moments and waves that might sort of frustrate thinking about them as part of a continuity or a continuous British literature, as this course would suggest. So kind of coming off of stuff we've talked about in previous videos, I wanted to look in particular. I wanted to use book culture as a lens. That is the culture of the book, the material making of a book, and what it implied, and how the changes in the way books were made and perceived influenced the way that works, that is texts or poems, even in our case, were conceived, and how we read them today. So starting from where we kind of left off, I wanted to start with the Beowulf manuscript again. This is the beginning of Beowulf. We talked about this in a previous video. I wanted to say a little bit more about what it takes to make a medieval manuscript and to emphasize certain aspects of it. So for one, making a medieval manuscript involved a lot of people. It involved a lot of steps. Even just to get the blank paper ready to write on required a massive amount of expertise and a lot of steps from the animal itself. A lot of medieval manuscripts were made with either calf or sheep skin. So from there to the book was an immense process, an immense technological achievement. And at every step, there was a different person, almost a different person at every step with a very different level of expertise. And so value was added to the material each step in the process. So beginning with the animal itself and the animal husbandry, the shepherds and the farmers that would raise the animal. And the animal had to be in a pretty good health. That is, the skin of the animal had to be in pretty good shape for it to qualify to become the skin of a manuscript page. So starting from the animal, when the animal was killed, the skin would be taken, first it would be butchered, but the skin would be taken to somebody called a tanner. And they are the ones that prepared skins and sometimes furs, but mostly leathers and vellum, that is the material of manuscript pages. So one thing you would do is laboriously scrape off the hair of... Strange, the animal control car is like menacing our neighborhood right now. Sorry. You would scrape the hair off of the skin using like this long blade thing. Or the skin would be put into sort of a vat that was filled up with one of a number of different sort of totally nasty caustic chemicals, among which is lime. Very dangerous. Being a tanner was one of the most shortest lifespans careers in the Middle Ages. So you would soak your skins in these vats filled with lime and lots of other materials for quite a long time, and it would be sort of corroding and breaking down the hair so that it could be more easily cut off of the skin or even just sloughed off. So the tanner would then maybe be involved in the preparation of the skin, or maybe not. It would be maybe a different profession. The skin would then be stretched on a frame. This was so that it could dry without sort of scrunching up and condensing, and it would turn into a very tough material. While it was stretched out, somebody would take this kind of curved axe thing and scrape off any remaining imperfections from the skin. This is immensely tough. In fact, it's one of the most sort of successful writing materials in the world. It's very hard to tear or break this stuff, unlike paper. So from that step, the paper would, once it was dry, which took a while, it would be cut off of the frame into sheets, and the sheets would be rolled up and they would be sent over to a scriptorium. Usually in the early Middle Ages especially, these were mostly exclusively in monasteries, where somebody with yet another field of immense training would actually copy the manuscript. So here you can see up at the top, perhaps the source book, the source text from which this copy is being made. Notice the pages haven't been cut yet. They're still in something like their open folio sheets. There's not a book that you're copying into. You copy onto the sheet itself. So this guy, the scribe, had an immense amount of training, different from the others, but in order to learn how to write, which was involved an entire sort of toolbox of stuff, including making inks and making quills and the scrapers and all of the other instruments of the trade, you in the process were also learning Latin to a level of fluency that is sort of beyond any classics professor in our day and age. So yeah, each of these steps was employing somebody, a different profession with a different level of skill and technology, and adding immense amounts of value to this artifact, this sort of prestige object that is the book, each one absolutely unique. Additionally, unlike the Beowulf manuscripts, some manuscripts were made for a much sort of higher level audience, and they would involve a much more elaborate ornamentation. So you see in each sort of sections are blocked off by these larger illuminated capitals. Sometimes there's an image within. Different colored ink. Sometimes every different color you see would have been a different person, a different scribe adding it. The art would definitely be a different person. And this is before the age of anything that was recognizably painting in our sense. Canvas was not really used as a painting medium. The medieval book was really the place that you would look to find image and art in the Middle Ages. And that was yet another expertise. Zooming in on sort of a letter, this is a different manuscript, although hardly less elaborate. So in addition to the color, and some of these colors, especially blue, were very hard to get. So remember, all of the inks have to be made from products out of the earth. There's no synthetic colors. But you might notice a bit of a shine in this. That is actual gold. This is proper when we talk about illumination or illuminated manuscripts. It is because gold, which in a way was conceived of as generating its own light or containing light, gold was actually sort of cut and glued onto the page. And that was yet another person. So every single step of the way was a different person. However, very seldom, here's just an example of one of the most immensely sort of elaborate manuscripts, just total pieces of art. So there's a book for you, a unique, unrepeatable, uncopyable piece of artwork, a collaborative art. In fact, maybe the total expertise of the Middle Ages, in a way, was funneled into the making of a book. So what was the point I was going to get to a second ago? Shoot, it's gone. Doesn't really matter. Oh, that was the point, right? So as with the Beowulf manuscript, it is rare that we know the names of anyone involved in any of these processes. Records can give us the names in general of tanners sometimes, of farmers, of scribes, and sometimes of the authors of works that go into these sorts of things. But more often than not, books like these do not necessarily bear titles as we would understand titles, don't necessarily sometimes bear authors, although very often, of course, there are named medieval authors. Very often, however, they're not. So most of the work, in other words, that funnels into these objects of art are anonymous. Most of the authors go unnamed. That is, in other words, to say that there was not really the same sense of authorship or creation as there is today when it comes to the book. However, each book was far more than for us a work of art. In fact, it'd be hard to say that any book that you went and picked up at Barnes & Noble was a work of art. It's just a copy. So keep that in mind for a minute. Now I'm going to zip back and we're going to take kind of a show and tell quick run here through texts, manuscripts, moving from at the time of the Beowulf manuscript, going up towards what we're reading for this week in 1660s. Paradise Lost. This is a page from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles. You might notice a bit of a bump in quality from the Beowulf manuscript. There's this not illuminated, but illustrated or historiated capital with several different colors of ornamentation. and the text itself seems to be of a higher caliber. Keep a notice on the look of the text, the look of the script as we go, because that is a bit of a signature of the scribe's training. Different nations, different places, and different times had different styles of writing. And we can often date manuscripts by the styles because they were so linked to places and times. So you'll notice that this is sort of a quadrata. It's almost a, that is to say, that each letter almost takes up its own little square of space. And it's there's some ascenders and descenders. These are important factors, but not too drastic in their fluidity, I guess I should say. Moving on a little bit, we see yet one of the other languages of British literature, Latin, and this is a Psalter, interspersed again, as we saw in the Lindisfarne Gospels, with an Old English gloss. And you might notice the difference in the script of the Latin, and it's sort of more insular, usually style. Insular, what do they call it? Dang it. I'm not a manuscript expert, so I've only studied this stuff sort of tangentially to my literary training. But at any rate, you'll notice a much different, more cursive-y style of writing in the Old English in between. This is a Welsh manuscript, yet another of the languages of British literature. It's got a very similar script to that of Old English writing, and yet it's a completely different language. This is obviously not a very high caliber manuscript, although it seems damage has kind of come to it over the years. But just to show yet another, this is actually a fictional work, the Mabinogion, which is a collection of kind of Celtic fantasy works. This is a page from one of the most important books ever written, ever made, I should say. This is a page from the Doomsday Book. So this is sort of my way of leaping over what happened in 1066 when the Normans, which were actually a Scandinavian, that is a Viking people, that sort of took over the northern French coast and set up shop there. The Normans are the Northmen. So the Normans kind of assimilated to the local linguistic culture, and so they did speak French, but in a way they were sort of, I guess I should say genetically in a callous way, Scandinavian. So what happened in 1066 was, in a way, Scandinavians taking over another country of Scandinavians that had recently been conquered by other Scandinavians, that is the Danes. Tons of frickin' Scandinavians. So William the Conqueror, who was the king who brought the army of Normans to England and won, and set up a dynasty there, he decreed that there be more or less a complete inventory of his new kingdom, of his new country. And so for several years, information, like a vast amount, an insane amount of information was collected from England about everything. Landholders, manors, villages, peasant holdings, common lands, the animals, the tools, the churches, just the nobles, everything was taken into account in this Titanic. It's just a massive book, like the modern translation. You really have to fist the thing. It's called the Doomsday Book because it's as if it were the book that contains the entire world, the information in the entire world. It is simply the most complete historical document that had ever been up to that point. I think in the world I can't think of anything comparable. So suddenly something like the Dark Ages becomes completely illuminated, a sort of lamplight lights onto England, and we see suddenly almost everything, where before we would have had to hack together these details from stray references and things like that Anglo-Saxon Chronicle I showed a while ago. So the Doomsday Book is written in Latin, and it's in a very highly abbreviated Latin. It's a very administrative Latin. You might notice, I'm not going to try to zoom in for fear of screwing this up, but you might notice a lot of little squiggles and stuff in between the lines. This is because the language is exceedingly abbreviated. Anything that could be kind of made into a little squiggle above the line is done. There was an entire sort of elaborate side language of making abbreviations in Latin manuscripts, and this partakes of that in spades, just to maybe conserve space because the labor, the work of condensing this information was so vast. So 1066 is usually marked as a major break in the continuity of English culture. Yeah, maybe. On the other hand, the language did not change as much as myth would have. It did not change much at all, in fact. And the French borrowing that people think to be constitutive of modern English happened actually in centuries later, and it did not have much of an effect at all on English grammar, but it did add yet another literary language to British literature. This is French in particular, Norman, Anglo-Norman, or the sort of Norman French spoken in England. These are poetries, they're called the Lays, written by, oops, I put that in the wrong place, written by a woman named Marie de France, one of the first major female voices from the Middle Ages that we know about. Notice she has a name, although it doesn't say much. Marie de France just says Mary from France, which is a funny thing to call somebody. She's actually probably born in England, perhaps in the court of Henry II. So let's see here. Yeah. So here we see something innovative. Poetry is now clearly written in lines. Notice with Beowulf, we talked about this. It's as if it were prose on the page. The ends of lines don't really matter, but now every two lines rhyme with each other in couplets. So the ends of lines matter, and that is reflected in the way that Romance language poetry is written in lines. And this is a long Old French poem, Anglo-Norman poem, and it's written so it's demarcated into these lines, which are now so distinctive. So along with everything else in the language, the import of the French language, and the importation of a new kind of poetry that is rhyming poetry in lines into England, one consequence of the Norman conquest was the sort of ironically the increasing interest in native Celtic mythology. So Marie de France usually wrote in something like the Arthurian world. Well, this is 12th century. In the 14th century, we have a long-established Arthurian tradition now in English. And this was maybe its medieval pinnacle, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, which you may have read or heard about. Again, it's like Beowulf. There's only one manuscript of this poem in the world until it was edited and copied in modern times. It's not a very luxurious-looking manuscript. Despite this, the art is just crap compared to other 14th century work, which we'll look at in a minute. But here you do see, even though you have alliterating lines like in Beowulf, it is now in lines. It's not in prose. So we're now in something like the Middle English phase, and here is what's usually considered its masterpiece. These are the first lines of the Canterbury Tales by Geoffrey Chaucer in just a glorious manuscript called the Ellesmere manuscript. Chaucer was copied a lot, and after he died in he died in 1400, and in the decades after, his appeal, his popularity just exploded. I don't want to lose track of the theme of continuity here. You might, if I zoomed in, you might have a very recognizably hard time reading the letters of these. They're still in something like a blocky form. They're still very much in the continuous form of medieval scripts, although you might notice that the ascenders and descenders have a little extra trill to them, a little extra swirl and knot and ornament. But you'll see some familiar things from previous slides, like just the elaborate, colorful side work that is indicative of the art of the Middle Ages. Again, we don't know who made this book. We just know that many people worked on this book. I don't even think I mentioned before that after that scribe was done with the pages, then those pages were folded and stitched and bound, each of which was yet another expertise. So this book is just a Ferrari of books. It's beautiful. This is another page from it, and you can see an artist has even been called to create these little miniatures of all of the pilgrims of the Canterbury Tales. This is actually Chaucer's portrait. It's taken from a picture that was made by a friend of his named Thomas Huckley when he died. It's sort of copied from that image. But another artist has made this beautiful little image here. So once again, this is where you go to see images in the Middle Ages, painting not really yet being the thing that it became in the so-called Renaissance, which we're coming to. Other Chaucerian manuscripts of the same text are equally elaborate. Most of what you see here that looks ugly is later damage. But immense amounts of work, even some illumination, that is the application of gold to the manuscripts. And still something like a continuous development of the same sort of writing, a writing that was meant to be as beautiful as it was legible, if not more so, in this collective work of art that is the medieval book. So, continuity aside, this thing changed everything. but maybe not as much right away as you might expect. This is the printing press. This is a reconstruction of Johannes Gutenberg's printing press. He was a goldsmith in Germany, or what became Germany, in the 1440s, and created this thing for mass producing books, which was a totally new concept. A concept that was in danger of being laughed out of existence by people who came to expect the work of art, the individual piece of art that the manuscript book was before. So, 1440 is about when Johannes Gutenberg, I think, I don't really have my dates on Gutenberg in my brain right now, I'm sorry. Wikipedia everything I say. Anyway, that was in 1440, so in the 1470s, a London printer was opened, a London printing press by a man named William Caxton, who is very famous and maybe one of the more influential persons in the history of the English language. This is a much later etching of him, but there's a lot of things, a lot of information here that is probably true. One is the very similar look of the printing press to Johannes Gutenberg's. And two is the fact that there's still lots of sort of apprentices doing various kinds of work, but it's very different kinds of work than the various stages of creation of a medieval manuscript. Now you set the type, which doesn't require so much as expertise as time. And over here it appears there's still some stitchers and binders who would have required some expertise. But in general, most of the expertise of the book creation process had been converted into a mechanism, had been mechanized, automated by the printing press, which created things that look like this. This is a page from the first book printed in English in England by William Caxton's printing press. It's a history of the Trojan War. One thing I want to stress here, though, is that, well, if you look at it, and I'll kind of zip back real quick to some of these examples of 14th, 15th century manuscripts handwriting, the printed page is trying to look like medieval manuscript handwriting. That is what it was in competition with, and that is what it aspired to be, because that is what the audience wanted. That is what the book buying culture, which, by the way, had very much popularized and secularized since the time of Beowulf, that is to say, literacy among non-clerical, non-priest classes was on the rise, though still dismal compared to any modern figure. But the book itself, the printed book, at first, was interested in looking like medieval manuscripts. It was interested in trying to simulate the artwork of the medieval manuscript. This is called The Golden Legend. William Caxton translated this massive Latin book. It's just lives of saints, one after another. But you can see here, too, that now the sort of multi-column and illustrated versions of medieval manuscripts is being approximated here. Approximated, but not equal, not simulated perfectly. The little wood blocks probably, or I'm assuming those are woodblock cuttings, are simply just not up to the task of resembling, say, this artwork in the margins of the Ellesmere manuscript of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. It's blocky, and the lines are much more visible. It would probably have been considered by the readership second rate to such a manuscript. Here also more to the point is part of the Canterbury Tales, which Caxton printed in, I think, 1476, and he also edited the text heavily, which is another aspect of manuscript culture I want not to get lost. That is to say, every time you copied a medieval manuscript, there was an opportunity to change things. A printing press just slaps down the same thing over and over again, but every copy of a medieval manuscript might have changed things. You even see authors writing little lines in their poems or their texts as if to the scribe, saying something like, if you can make this even better, go right ahead. So there's something that just does not resonate with us at all. Imagine David Foster Wallace, or I don't know, pick your author, Toni Morrison, hearing back from the publisher that they went ahead and tried and improved their novel, for them. Maybe that's editing, I don't know. So here's just a couple more pages from William Caxton. I want to emphasize once again the way that the letters, the writing, that is the font, is simulating medieval manuscript handwriting. So, another hiccup, or maybe the larger hiccup, in the idea of continuity between Beowulf and Milton is this thing that we call the Renaissance. What exactly is the Renaissance? It's a feature-length movie topic in itself. This is Raphael's School of Athens, in which the painter Raphael seems to have depicted Leonardo da Vinci as Plato and Michelangelo as Aristotle, and then lots of other contemporaries as the philosophers of Athens. Why did some 15th century Italian painter find himself and his contemporaries analogous or somehow contextualized by ancient Greek philosophers? So one aspect of this, now I'm going to sort of take a little detour here for a minute, but I want to get to the point of what continuity kind of means for us and what the Renaissance meant as it inflects our reading of things like Edmund Spenser and John Milton, which are usually considered part of the Renaissance. Here's one of many significant things that might inform this question. So in 1453, the Ottoman Turks, who were extremely powerful and culturally advanced, by the way, conquered Constantinople. They took it and they never let it go. Istanbul is still the capital of Turkey. It had been since 1453. So the Byzantine Empire had been had a separate piece, a separate and different culture from the West, from the Catholic West, in many ways, theologically, linguistically. That is to say that their sort of primary linguistic culture was centered on Greek, while as the West's was centered on Latin and its vernaculars. The Byzantine Empire was sort of the last holdout of the Roman Empire, whereas medieval Europe had sort of moved on, I guess. I'm being very general here just to make some points. But 1453, the Byzantine Empire conclusively fell. So this meant lots of things, but since we're talking about book culture, one of the most important things that happened as a result of this was that a lot of literate and literary people and authors and translators and scholars from the East had migrated to the West to escape the Ottoman Empire and the possible Muslim conversion. So what that meant for the West is that suddenly all of these works from ancient Greece and even some works from ancient Rome that had been lost for centuries were suddenly rediscovered or brought back into circulation in one shape or form. So there's many people involved in this and many ways in which it changed everything, or maybe was thought to have changed everything. Homer, for instance. Homer was known as a name and respected as this great poet that, however, the medieval Europe had lost, or the Western world had lost, and couldn't read anyway because there was very little Greek scholarship in Europe at this time. So at any rate, Greek came back in a major way, and we see this in highly learned Greek, Latin readers like Edmund Spenser and John Milton. But before him, in the 14th century, 15th century, we have people like this guy you've probably never heard of. His name's Poggio Bracciolini. He's sort of this great humanist book hunter. He would just scour libraries, private collections, and converse with all of these new imports and immigrants from the East to try to find these lost works that they knew the names of but they didn't have. And he found tons of them. He didn't just find tons of them, tons of these lost Roman works. He copied them himself so that they could be circulated. And when he did, he didn't just copy them, he created an entirely new way of copying them. This is an example of Poggio Bracciolini's actual handwriting. Now, I'm not going to flip back. You could zip back in the video if you want, but you might notice that as opposed to those medieval manuscripts and early printing press products, this is very legible to us. In fact, it's only a small step between this and fonts that you know from your computer, like Times New Roman and Calibri, etc. This is a modern font. This is not, once again, to stress, this is not a printed page. This is handwritten. This is Poggio Bracciolini's innovation. To make a text that, as opposed to being more elaborate and beautiful than legible, it is far more legible than beautiful. Although you might say this has a certain beauty in itself. The text block is perfectly, we call it, justified on the page. There's a more or less consistent shape to the letters wherever they appear. In other words, a D down here won't look much different from a D up here, and so forth. So this concept of writing to be universally legible, he doesn't abbreviate almost anything either, which was a quality of Latin and italic scripts. This innovation was very influential, such that I want to stress once again, too, that the printing press was not interested in, at first, in any difference in font and appearance of the text. It was simply interested in simulating as much as possible for cheaper and with less people involved, the medieval manuscript copy, the medieval manuscript. So add a century, go from 1470s of William Caxton's printing press to the 1590 of the creation of Edmund Spenser's Faerie Queene, and you have a printed book that looks like this. So it is no mere coincidence that this looks more like Poggio Bracciolini's handwriting than it does like William Caxton's font or the Ellesmere scribe. That is intentional. Or rather, it is a merger of these two different developments. One, the interest in copying texts for immediate literacy, for immediate understandability, intelligibility, and quick standardized printing pages, printed press. Here's the first few lines of it. I'm sorry, it's a little scrubby, but there's other things that are very evident here. For the first time, this is sort of the title page, we would call it. Notice the prominent title. Notice the printing location and the printing press and the date. Most of the bibliographic material that we would need for, say, a modern bibliography is here. A little extra here and sort of an opening seal, an ornamentation. No color is involved here, so in a way, the printed page is already cheapening as the audience's demands moved away from wanting the object of art that was the medieval book and wanting simply a legible text. So here we have, after this sort of opening verse or this little dedication, we have the author's name, which is something that is there sometimes and isn't there. I want to also stress, we still don't know who made any of this, except for the printer himself, this guy William Ponsonby. But yeah, and here again we have the text in the shapes that we've come to expect it, with a little holdback, a little throwback to medieval manuscripts in the form of these larger illustrated letters. But here we have lines, and we also have a very modern, recognizable kind of punctuation, which was developing at the time, not necessarily where we would want the same punctuation to be. And we also have other stuff, which is for the printer, although you might notice some of this stuff appearing in some of your own books sometimes, sort of page numbering systems. And this is the first word that will appear on the next page, just to make sure that when you fold all of the little pages into their quires, their little packets or bundles before you sew it up, you have them all in the right order. So let's move forward another few decades, and we'll see maybe a very recognizable book, if I can get my video out of the way here. This is the so-called First Folio of William Shakespeare, 1623. Just a ton of his plays were collected, and this is the first time some of them appeared in print. So we've had some leaps here, but none really categorically or qualitatively different in the way that the text looks, mostly in the way that the presentation of the book is being put forward. Again, we have the standard printings information that we usually get in text books today, but now we have, more prominent than anything else, the author's name, Mr. William Shakespeare, and the title is even less prominent than that. And then we have a striking image of the author himself, which for some reason it seems the audience wanted to see. This entire front page of this folio, of the First Folio of Shakespeare, is sort of a shrine to the author, as if no one else really matters. Notice how much smaller the printer and maybe editors of this book are compared to the author. Now I know you might say, well, this is Shakespeare, but you know, Shakespeare hadn't been dead but for a decade or so. How big was Shakespeare? He definitely wasn't the sort of God thing that we worship today. Let's go forward a few years, actually about 40 years, to the text we're reading this week, Paradise Lost. Now here you see more or less a variation on the theme. Although the title, originally only 10 books, not all 12 were published, but the title takes up still a bit more room than the author's name, and yet it's very recognizable. Once again, we also want to see the author, and in a way, even less pronounced are the names of the people who made this book. That is, made the actual book. Their number was probably vastly reduced, such that compared to the years of work of raising the animal, of preparing the skin, of getting it to the scribe, of illustrating, now you have a process of very little time, especially if this is paper. I think it was. It is. Yeah, sorry. So in terms of continuity, so many things have happened, and I mentioned the Renaissance in brief. It wasn't actually the focus of this. But in a way, the Renaissance was a reflection or a story that the West began to tell about itself. A story that in a way doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And that story says that we, I'm speaking for them now, like the European West, somehow came from the Greco-Roman world, the classical world. Two concepts are born in that moment. One, the concept of Europe as undergoing a renaissance. Two, the classical world as a thing. And then in a way, three, another concept was invented in this same moment, the moment that said that there had been a break of continuity, that we are now actively restoring in our rebirth, that is, Renaissance. And that is the idea of the Middle Ages. Obviously, no one in the year 1000 went around saying, here in the Middle Ages, right? It wasn't how they conceived of themselves. Medieval simply means middle age. This is a term that arises at about the same time as this term Renaissance, which is a way in which, at that point, modern European culture tried to sort of staple itself onto ancient Greco-Roman culture. Whereas if you had gone and talked to, say, a Roman in the Republic days, say, what do you think about those Germans and those Celts that lived to the north, they probably would have said total barbarians. And yet the sort of modern version, well, in the 17th, 16th, 17th century, those modern versions of those Celts and Germans reimagined themselves, remade themselves, as it were, as the natural sort of development of the classical world. And so they started to just ingest and reflect classical culture in many different kinds of ways. It's why you see on almost every page of Milton references to and incorporations of classical literature. So in a way, it's a kind of imagined continuity that creates a radical discontinuity, because in order to tell this story about itself, the Renaissance had to sever ties with the Middle Ages and consider it something like a dark age in between the classical world that it emulated and itself. So a lot of sort of historical violence was created or perpetrated in this invention of the Renaissance. And to what end, you might say, well, perhaps to the end of things like Paradise Lost, which with a name like Paradise Lost suddenly seems to be very much in the game of talking about historical and cultural continuity. So to get back closer to the theme and to finish, just one thing I wanted to stress in this video, in addition to the change of the shape of the book, was the change in the way a book was made and a book was conceived. So whereas a medieval manuscript, to go back to what we began with, was the product of lots of different trained high-tech labor for the time, of more or less anonymous people, just sort of pouring their work and their intention and their artistry into an individual, unrepeatable work of art that is the medieval book. We have at the end of this process of increasing sort of clarity in writing, emphasizing clarity or intelligibility over artistic quality. And in this process of the printing press, which is to create any number of copies, exact copies you want, we have something like the birth of the author, as we understand it. The author as the most important person in the book, of the book. We don't go to Barnes & Noble and pick up a book and say, well, I'm looking for something printed by Vintage. Vintage Press. I'm looking for something printed by Penguin. I want the latest Penguin books. Most people don't do that. They go in there and they say, I'm looking for, I don't know, the latest Elizabeth George mystery. I'm looking for this William Faulkner book I've always wanted to read. I'm looking for Paradise Lost by John Milton. We think of books as things made by authors, and we sort of overlook the fact that it was made by, well, for us, mostly machines, but some work still was put into it by those printers and publishers and editors. Their work has, in our eyes, vastly diminished, and now we think about books as being by authors. And those names are prominent in the front pages of the books that tell us what they are. And the authors knew it. So how we see Milton presenting himself as almost equivalent to Jesus in the way that he can whip around the universe, or as almost equivalent to Satan in the way that he goes back and forth from hell and earth, I think is very much in the play of thinking about or of self-consciously reflecting on this new cult of the author that arose as a sort of co-consequence of the Renaissance and the printing press, etc. Things to think about. Since I've been off for so long, I'm sure I'm going to have many more videos, many more things that I want to say about Milton before we're done with him, so I'll probably post another video, maybe even today or tomorrow. But this is more than enough for now. See you guys next